Welcome to the Crime Dawg Podcast with your host and content creator, Johnny Fiorica, who claims to have an alpha male immune system, but takes a daily dose of Claritin because of his chronic allergies. Sit back, relax, and enjoy the show.
Folks, welcome to the Crime Dawg Podcast. I'm your host, Johnny Fiorica, 30-year veteran, Rochester Police Department, recently retired October of 2023 after serving 30 years with the department. Sitting alongside me tonight, my first guy up on deck, my trusted co-host, David Simpson, 20-year veteran, retired, legendary street cop, undercover cop. He was a homicide cop, and he is the co-host of the Crime Dawg Podcast, David Simpson.
Happy to be here. Thanks, Doc.
Gratuitous golf clap from Jason, our next co-host. Jason is also a legendary street cop, 2.5 decades with the Rochester Police Department. He is a legendary hostage negotiator. He is also the self-proclaimed alpha male of our podcast, and a self-proclaimed Hall of Famer, 1994, of which we don't know. Jason Blanchard, welcome to the pod.
Johnny, thank you. Thank you, Doc. I appreciate that. I'm happy to be here. I feel like the first lead-in that you did for this show tonight, that our producer forgot to hit the record button on, so now we're doing it again. I feel like that might have been a little stronger of a lead-in, but I digress, and I kick it back to you.
Yeah, I don't know. You threw me and the producer under the bus, but that's okay.
That's all right.
We're
all human, Johnny. We're all human.
We're not gonna have what we call behind-the-scenes conversations in front of the camera.
That's correct.
Especially in front of our guests.
We don't want to fight in front of guests.
You know the number one favorite did not bring that up, right?
You did bring it up.
Right.
You didn't bring it up, but you did give me the mocha by saying that it was going to happen. Folks, what they're talking about is our super producer, Danny Agnew, who never messes anything up. There was a little bit of an issue with hitting the record button. We had a great intro. We started the interview with our super guest for tonight, and anything happens with the recording stuff, and we had to start over. That's what they're talking about. So without further ado, Dr. Mark Gestring, thanks for coming to the pod, sir.
Well, thank you very much for having me. It's been a privilege to watch the excitement behind the scenes here, and I look forward to having a conversation with you guys.
Well, listen, we've done this with all our guests, regardless of their profession and background, Doc. If you want to give our audience a quick overview of your resume, your schooling, your background, your experience, family, anything you want to talk about, just to give us an insight as to who you are and where you came from.
Sure. So I've been a trauma surgeon at the University of Rochester for just about 24 years. Prior to that, I was at the University of Pennsylvania, where I learned how to do trauma surgery specifically. I did a fellowship there. And before that, I was in Rhode Island at Brown University. I actually grew up in New Jersey. And a little known fact actually about me is I was one of the first civilian police dispatchers in a town called Maplewood, New Jersey, back in the probably mid-'80s. And I started on a Lily Tomlin type switchboard. I don't know if you guys remember those things, but so I was one of the first civilian dispatchers when the Maplewood Police Department switched over from older police officers and people who should have probably been doing other things to kind of a more civilian model. So I did that, and then I was an EMT in the city of Newark, New Jersey, for a number of years while I was in school. So kind of that's what led me to my trauma surgeon career, and actually I've had a real interest in law enforcement ever since the early days, if you will. So I think that partnership has continued in a number of different ways as I've moved along in my work.
So you've always had some type of relationship or affiliation with law enforcement that continues today.
Yeah, it's interesting. So I was a police dispatcher before I knew I wanted to be a doctor, quite honestly, and I was really interested in that kind of work. And I knew I was in school, so I couldn't really do the police side of it, but working, and it's a small police department, everything happens right in front of you. It's not like today where the dispatch centers are completely removed.
Right.
So everything happened kind of right in front of you. And it was a very interesting way to kind of go through school.
What's really going to be cool, and we're going to talk about this in a couple segments, but I want to get into some other stuff right now. We have a lot of mutual friends and acquaintances, and we're going to get into your Project Exile stuff that you do locally with the ATF guys and Mike Kern and Mark Lee and those guys, but I can't wait to get into that stuff with you. But I want to first start off, Doc, as I hit my studious notes, which I never take. You have the University of Rochester, and we talked about this off camera. We had a number of guests that have been on our show. We had Captain Umbrino, we had Mike Kern from the head of ATF, but we've had a lot of guests on, and they give your unit a lot of credit. I know Captain Frank Umbrino did, saying that he felt through his experience being the leader of our homicide unit in Rochester, New York, that he felt like our homicides would go way up if it wasn't for you and your staff at the hospital.
Well, I will say that that's the case nationally. I think trauma care has really advanced. I'm extremely blessed to work with some fantastic people. I mean, I think we've probably outgrown our facility a little bit. Most of you guys have spent some time in our trauma bay, and thankfully they're building us a brand new one. You see all the construction going on, but the people there are fantastic. I've been really blessed to be able to recruit some really good surgeons, really good kind of team members. And you're right. I think we collectively save a lot of lives that maybe wouldn't be as lucky, wouldn't be as successful if it wouldn't be for a real level 1 trauma center in a city this size. As you guys know, we get quite a bit of violence, so those kind of things. Plus, we get a good amount of trauma from the surrounding region. So, it doesn't make the news anywhere near as much, but we cover 17, 18 counties. So every time somebody gets run over by a tractor or caught in some farming gizmo, if they survive the trip, they end up in our hospital, and we take care of those patients too. So we have really a very broad mix of injury. And because you guys see this in your own work. If you recruit a good team of people, then it's easier to recruit new people to come to that team because it's a good team. So we're very lucky in perpetuating that. And, I tease the politicians and law enforcement officers I meet. I think it's true, but it's certainly a collective. It's a partnership that, we're successful.
Doc, so you talk about recruitment and you talk about hiring, and you say you have a tremendous team underneath you. As the head of the trauma surgeon unit, the acute, would you call it the acute?
Yeah, so I'm the division chief for something called acute care surgery, which includes trauma and our burn trauma intensive care unit.
So when you're looking for doctors to come and work for you, like what are some of the characteristics that you're looking for in those people?
There's two things. So what are we looking for in them? And then what are they looking for in us? So what we're looking for in them, we're looking for somebody with a good work ethic, a good personality, a good attitude, and somebody who brings a good skill set. So all of the people that we have currently working for us, all of the surgeons have come from really good training backgrounds, really good fellowships. So they have the skills, and they've been selected because they have the personality. They can do the work. It's difficult work. You meet all kinds of people at all kinds of hours. You need to be able to do that kind of thing. On the flip side, we want to recruit the best. We want the best recruits to look at us. And the way we do that is by being nationally relevant. I mean, the work that we do in Rochester is great, but we're also doing things nationally. All of our doctors are doing different things for different societies. We have a reputation. We're known. We write papers. We have a very strong educational history. We train trauma surgeons there. So people come to us to learn how to do this work elsewhere. And we train medical students. We train nursing students. We train, so those people come to the University of Rochester, specifically Strong Memorial Hospital, to learn these skills. And, we have the privilege of showing them a lot of these things and taking them through some of these, complex resuscitations and complex care scenarios. And that makes us a desirable place to work because, as you know, Rochester's, a nice place to live, great place to raise a family, but it's also, it's a busy place to be in a trauma hospital. So I think we have a unique place in the world where we are able to recruit really good people and keep them because it's a good place to work.
My co-hosts look like they're chomping at the bit to get you a doc.
I just wanted to point out first that the doctor's title is so impressive that you weren't even able to say it. So, we did discuss that our combined SATs were probably not equivalent to the doctor. So that in and of itself was, a bit of an impressive stat that you couldn't even work
in the
through.
First intro.
I got probably a pretty simple question for you that I was just thinking as you talk about all the surrounding counties that you guys cover, 17 surrounding counties. And I know Mercy Flight is a big, a big thing down in the southern tier, right? When is that like a daily occurrence that you guys are receiving the Mercy Flight coming in? Is that not as often as?
Well, I think it's weather dependent and season dependent. We're filming this in the evening. I think we got like 6 helicopters today. Over the course of the day, we work predominantly with 3 companies. We work with Mercy Flight Central, who are based in Canandaigua. We work with Mercy Flight Western, who come out of the Buffalo area, mostly Batavia, and then LifeNet, which works down in the Hornell region. But we call them all collectively Mercy Flights because they're kind of medical helicopters. But there's probably maybe 7 helicopters that service our region. And, if the weather's good, I mean, we probably had 10 helicopters come in and out yesterday,
Wow.
over the course of Sunday.
Believe it or not, Doc, we have actually listeners in the Midwest and people that may not know what Mercy Flight is. Could you explain to our audience what that is?
Sure. So it's funny how two different companies ended up with the same type of name, but essentially we use Mercy Flight generically to talk about medical helicopters that respond predominantly in our area. They respond to scenes and they help out local EMS agencies with complicated patients and they bring them to the trauma center. So like I said, we have Mercy Flight Central and Mercy Flight Western, which are two different organizations. We tend to work more with the ones that are closer, but realistically, these are highly experienced crews. They have flight nurses and flight paramedics that have many years of experience, and they're frequently the most experienced person at the scene. And they will take care of intubation and medication administration and things like that. And then the helicopter, which travels at a pretty good rate of speed, 150 miles an hour, will get people here in a straight line much faster than if they drove. So it's a partnership. We worked with them a couple of years ago now they have permission to hang blood in the helicopter. That was something that needed to work through New York State and through legislation and all that kind of stuff. So we helped with the advocacy for that. And just the simple act of them being at the scene with the skill sets they have, and now they're carrying blood. They've saved a number of lives doing that.
So Doc, when you were talking about your recruitment, I couldn't help to go back to like 20, 25 years ago and how this has evolved. I'm sure you're going to say it's kind of a collective, but would you say over the time that the medical equipment or the medical, like the way you go about business has evolved to help save lives? Or is it the skill set of the young people that are coming up more so that has led to this advanced?
So it's interesting. There's a lot to your question. So first off, I can tell you that 20, 25 years ago, the prevailing philosophy was if you couldn't have a practice, you took care of trauma patients until you developed the practice. So it was very much of a side thing that you did. And it's not a criticism, it's just the way the world worked. The field, if you will, of trauma surgery really has evolved. It mostly came from the military in that, the kinds of skill set that you need at wartime, like what do you do with that in peacetime? And then people realized that the kind of injuries they were taking care of, there's really a need for that. And the science, if you will, or the field really has evolved. I remember vividly having conversations with senior surgeons when I first started at Strong saying, I want to focus in trauma. And they looked at me like, well, until you get a real job, right? And I said, well, and they didn't mean it in a bad way.
Was that because of pay? I mean,
no, it has nothing to do with pay. It just has to do with, getting your name out there as a private practice surgeon or something like that. And we made the argument that no, this is really what I do my first day of work is what I want to do my last day of work, taking care of the same kind of patients, the same kind of situations. And, it took a little while to ingrain that culture at our particular institution, but there's no question that, the University of Rochester is 100% on board with what we're doing. And, you guys know what would happen if we were to stop doing it. It would be a problem, because like I said, there's about 10 helicopters that came yesterday and 6 that came today and countless ambulances and how many people drove themselves here and providing a service to the community and the region that really nobody else is doing. And the University of Rochester really identifies itself as a resource to the neighborhood that it's in and to the region it's in. So we are absolutely providing a useful service to people that we serve, and we're doing it in a very specific way. Obviously the university does cancer care and pediatric care and a bunch of other things also, but when you're run over by a bus, you want to see my team. You just really want to see my team. You don't want to end up in another hospital. And realistically, if you end up at another hospital, the first thing they're going to do is send you to us, right? So it's just, we just have, we have the resources. We have what you talked about, the equipment, it's equipment, but more it's a care philosophy. You need people available 24/7. You need to be able to do something at 2:00 in the morning on a Sunday, just the same way you would do it on a Monday morning.
So for a layman like us, though, would the skill sets of young surgeons coming up, has it evolved? Are they that much more skilled? Like I turn it back to like athletes. Like athletes today are so much more skilled than athletes 20 years ago.
I don't think it's a skill thing because I think realistically, the people who I spoke with 20 years ago were extremely skilled surgeons. There's no question about that. I think we just have different techniques. Like we have learned, not just in Rochester, but just as a field, we have learned how to temporize problems. Where 20 years ago, the thought was if you can't fix it, it can't be fixed. Now our approach is just stop it from bleeding and we'll come back and deal with it tomorrow in an alive patient. Those kind of philosophies have really changed considerably over time. And certainly that's not unique to Rochester. That's unique to the field in general. But, I think the way we do things in Rochester is very comparable to the way things are done around the country in major centers. And we're very lucky to be, like I said, have a national reputation for doing things the way people are supposed to do them. And, it's all of it. It's the mindset. It's the skill set. There's no question that the early surgeons who were chiding me in a nice way were probably, I would say, probably more technically gifted than I was. But you wouldn't find them in the hospital at 3 a.m. either.
Right.
It's a whole different thing. And finding me in the hospital at 3 a.m. is not enough. You need me with my operative team and the nursing team and the ICU team and all the other stuff that comes with me. So building that system is really what makes it work.
I knew this podcast was going to be a good one. I knew it because I knew it because when you started talking about certain things that I have and that I want to get to, and I can't wait to get to them with you, namely the trauma stuff on the battlefield. Folks, we told you this was a good one. Stick with us on the other side. Dr. Mark Gestring from the University of Rochester Medical Center. WorkAlerts.com. That's WorkAlerts with a Z. WorkAlerts helps retail, restaurant, hospitality operators control their labor costs and better communicate with their staff through simple, easy-to-use work scheduling and text messaging system. Set budgeted hours for your departments to prevent overscheduling, manage employee time off requests, and availability. Again, that's WorkAlerts.com, WorkAlertz.com, labor management and employee engagement made simple. Folks, welcome back from the other side. We have Dr. Mark Gestring from the University of Rochester Medical Center. Doc, we were talking before the break. You had mentioned a topic that I wanted to bring up, and that was like wartime surgeons, combat surgeons that are actually in the field during wartime, in the military. You were talking about some of that expertise has crossed over to quote unquote the civilian world, if you will. Has that been since the beginning of time with wars, or did you see it accelerate since 2001?
I think it has accelerated considerably since there's been a more concerted effort on the part of the military to actually do research. So they spend a lot more time looking at their outcomes and looking at their treatment modalities. And I think one of the things that's interesting is the civilian world has learned a lot from the military side of things, but it flips when we're not at war. The military learns a lot from civilian side, and there's a number of partnerships where military surgeons are spending time in civilian trauma centers, quite honestly, because more people are getting shot in Los Angeles and Chicago than in Iraq right now, So those kinds of things, those kind of partnerships definitely exist. Perfect example is something like tourniquets. You guys are old enough to remember when we should never have used tourniquets. They were told us don't use them. And then in the military, they had a number of what they deemed preventable deaths from extremity bleeding, right? So it's arms and legs. And when they went back and looked at it, they said, well, maybe we really should be using tourniquets. And they figured out that that's not only did they figure out it's the right thing to do, but they came up with a CAT tourniquet design, which really worked well. And then they started basically teaching everybody, not just medics, how to use it. And, in what the I guess Iraq situation, they deployed people with tourniquets, whether you were a medic or a truck driver or, a soldier, you had a tourniquet, and they were able to drop what they call the preventable death rate by close to 70%.
Wow.
Because somebody who had an extremity injury, learned how to put their own tourniquet on or put it on their buddy. And then that kept somebody alive long enough to get back to a place where somebody could fix it. That information absolutely translated into the civilian world. And now all of the civilian efforts at teaching things like Stop the Bleed and all those kinds of things grew out of not just the idea from the military, but the initial literature and the kind of research that showed that it really worked.
And I'm not looking for a specific example, but just with your knowledge and your know-how relative to trauma regarding wartime combat surgeons and being in the field, was some of that they've learned, other than the tourniquet, some things like necessities, the mother of invention? They saw things that were out in the field and they're like, well, I'm going to try this because I don't have any other choice.
I think some of that actually came from the civilian world. Things like damage control surgery probably started more in the civilian world and got translated to the military, where the damage control is what I was alluding to earlier, where you kind of start an operation when the patient first comes in and you stop the bleeding and you stop the spillage of intestinal content and you leave everything unattached, come back the next day when the patient's a little bit better, and then work on restoring everything. Though I think those kinds of things started a little bit more in the civilian world and were translated to the military world and then were perfected in the military world. But the military has a unique population. Their patients are mostly young and healthy, right? So like translating that stuff to the civilian world, you have to think about it a little bit, because your average soldier is between 18 and 25, 30 years old, right? So when those guys get hurt, they come in healthier, they're in better shape. But then in, Iraq, they were taking care of civilians and they were taking care of children, and, it expanded quite a bit. For sure, there is a fellowship between military surgeons and civilian surgeons, and many of them are us and many of us are them. They work, I was never in the military, but many of my colleagues were in the military, are still reserve in the military, and have deployed multiple times in various different ways.
Yeah, that was my next question. Did you have anybody on your staff that came from overseas and said, yeah, I want to cross over into the civilian world after?
Yeah, so in Rochester, we don't currently have anybody, but there are just a number of people in my profession that have done that and continue to do that and bring a skill set, have learned and, like I said, bring the information both ways.
And Johnny, remind me, because I may be mistaken, but when Officer DePonzio was almost murdered, 15 years ago, I think it was now, Dr. Maurer, I think wasn't he a military surgeon?
Yep. He's a neurosurgeon.
Retired now?
Yep. He's retired. He's a neurosurgeon, and exactly a perfect example. Yeah.
Based on the trauma that he had seen and everything else. And I know he was an integral part of Tony's success, if you will, and able to survive that terrible situation. But yeah, I remember that well, that he was involved in that process of that. And it's, Doc, I was thinking of something as well. You're talking about the tourniquets. Myself and Johnny and David spoke about it in a previous episode, and we talked about the skill set of police officers and how that's changed over the years. And the guys and girls in patrol are out here carrying tourniquets on their duty belts. And that's something that, we never did. David joked and he said the way we used to, triage was get on the radio and say, step up EMS. And we didn't really render aid like we do now. And we're taught, all these things. I mean, we have Narcan, we have tourniquets, we have all these things that are getting these patients to a better state, prior to transport, prior to, to getting to you.
Well, yeah. So you stumbled into a topic that I actually really enjoy talking about, and it's a partnership that I actually really love to highlight. So, we do this thing. We teach Stop the Bleed, which is, it's a really basic kind of course for the non-medically trained civilian. But then we ramped up recently to do a little bit more of a tactical thing. And exactly like you said, police officers, if you go back a decade, were not routinely carrying tourniquets. Maybe SWAT guys were, but the average officer was not carrying a tourniquet, and probably should have been, right? And it is something that I think you learn in the academy, but you learn a bunch of other stuff too, and it's not something that's in the front of your mind, right? So recently, maybe not even so recently anymore, probably within the last maybe 5 to 7 years or so, we started first with the University of Rochester, and we went through. I mean, they have like 200 guys on their Department of Public Safety, right? It's a pretty big department. And we worked with them, and they have, Michael Brock is a training officer. I don't know if you guys know him. He's a fantastic guy. And we worked on a kind of train the trainer model, and we made sure each one of those guys and girls, each one had a tourniquet that they had available to them if they needed it. And that's kind of where we started, but then we rapidly expanded kind of into the community. And that's when we found out, like, for instance, the Rochester Police Department, you guys had tourniquets, but the equipment you had was a little bit antiquated. I don't know if you've ever looked at them, like the metal clips and buckles, and it was kind of a complicated machine, right? So then there was a transition over to CAT tourniquets, which we didn't really do. I think you guys kind of did that before we got there, but it was pretty clear that people didn't fully understand the value of that particular device. And then in the world, unfortunately, it became a little bit more normal to shoot at police officers, which is just, in my mind, crazy. But all of a sudden, there's a real desire to kind of be able to protect yourself if you need to, right? So it started as how do we refresh what a police officer has already learned? Because everybody learned it when you're in the academy, but you don't use it a lot. It's an extinguishable skill, and quite honestly, like the way those tourniquets are packed into the little container, you're not going to take it out and play with it because you'll never get it back in, right? So nobody wants to really mess with it. So we kind of came up with a system where we would have the exact same kind of tourniquets, and we would come and we would kind of do an instructional thing for the officers. And we did a lot with the state police. And then we did a lot with, we worked with a bunch of police departments. And then we linked up with a guy named Eric Rathfelder, who I think you guys all know. And Eric is, medically trained also. And it became clear to us that the tourniquets that RPD carried, like if you use that tourniquet, it's a while to get it back. There wasn't a system to get it back, which was a practical, like a logistics issue, but it was kind of crazy. Like you're going to be very careful about using that tourniquet if you know you're not going to get it back, right? I mean, if you show up in the hospital with a bloody sheet, we give you a clean sheet and you leave like on your ambulance, right? Almost immediately, right? So once Eric brought that up, we worked with something called the Rochester Police Foundation, which I'd be happy to talk about in a minute but the Rochester Police Foundation pretty much exists to support things that the police department needs but doesn't usually get in a budget, right? So they came up with a grant and they bought a bunch of tourniquets for you guys. So now you have a repository in each of your stations that you use a tourniquet, put whatever the system is, you put the record number that you used it, and then you get one back almost immediately. And that together with the trainer model that, Eric Rathfelder worked on and Fabian Rivera was extremely supportive of that effort. I think the skill set of your on-the-street officers now is much, much better than it was, and they're much more comfortable using this. And what that's translated into is, the tourniquet is, for me, God forbid I need it. Oh, but by the way, I'm the first on the scene of a shooting. I can really use my tourniquet. I know how to save a life, and I know I'm going to get mine back. Like I'm not going to lose it for the next 6 months, right? So we keep track. I don't know if you guys know this, but we do keep track when we get a tourniquet that's placed by law enforcement, and if it turns out to have been significant, we will follow that up with a letter to the department saying, officer, whatever, saved a life, and we make sure that they get recognized for that. And we have, I would say, what is it, August? I would say probably this year we've probably had 10 to 15 tourniquets placed by law enforcement that absolutely saved lives without question.
And that absolutely happens. There are the guys, men and women are recognized by the department. They get those letters and are recognized because I've seen them get them. So I mean,
so it's a win-win. So part of the tactical stuff, the average citizen just needs to know kind of how to control some bleeding. Mm-hmm. A police officer needs to know how to put the tourniquet on their left arm with their right hand, on their right hand with their left arm, this kind of stuff. It's a little bit different maybe because you're doing it behind the hood of a car while somebody's shooting at you. God forbid that never happens. But that was the original genesis of doing this. But now we find out that, as soon as you stop the bleeding, we can fix whatever's broken. But if the patient bleeds out before they get to the hospital, we have no chance. So and the police officers frequently, AMR gets just as much credit, but the police officers are there frequently before AMR. So we have had some spectacular saves where the police officer gets there and puts the tourniquet on, and through this whole partnership between the training and the RPD Foundation helping to provide the equipment. And it's not like you didn't have the equipment. You had the equipment, but just a system for replenishing it. Like you shoot your 6 bullets. I got to wait a month to get 6 more bullets. That doesn't work that way, right? So looking at it, the overall system, I think that really made a difference. And I think in Rochester, there's probably, if you ask me over the last 5 years, there's probably 20 people who are alive today because, maybe 30 that are alive today because, a police officer showed up and put that tourniquet on when they needed to.
Yeah, I'm not even trying to be funny. Obviously, it's a heavy topic, but there was no tourniquets when I came on. There was nothing. It was in the academy. That was 30 plus years ago. They taught you how to take your belt off of your pants and apply the tourniquet. That was literally the training. And then thank God it morphed into.
Yeah. And quite honestly, as a medical person 30 years ago, they were telling us we shouldn't be doing it.
Yeah.
When I was driving around in ambulances in the city of Newark, I never had a tourniquet either.
Yeah.
And now I wouldn't be, now I carry one everywhere I go. My kids have them in their backpacks, and we have probably 6 of them laying around the house. Hopefully we'll never need any of them. But
well, listen, you touched upon a great, I don't want to brush over it because I want to give them a shout out, the Rochester Police Foundation. And you touched on it quickly to get to your point, but they are phenomenal. And it's exactly what you said. It's a bunch of businessmen who are part of a committee, and they fund things that are outside the police budget, and they do a fantastic job providing goods and services to our officers that otherwise they wouldn't have. So yeah, shout out to the Police Foundation.
Yeah, I think that's very well said. I actually had the privilege of being part of their board of directors for a little while, and I was involved in some really cool projects at that group. You know, like you said, they raise money, and they take that money. 100% of that money goes to things that the police department needs but doesn't get other ways. So things like Shop with a Cop, things like the gift cards that captains have to give to families that have been involved in violence, or those kinds of things. Police dogs. I remember being involved when you got a SWAT vehicle that was donated, quote, for free from the government, but really wasn't for free because you had to paint it and put radios in it and figure out how to get it home from Kansas and all this other kind of stuff. So, you know, it's a fantastic group. They do really good work, and it's community focused work too. It's puts police in the forefront, but also it's for the good of the community, to the work that they do. And then
they've been doing God's work for our officers for over a decade. Folks, stick with us on the other side. Dr. Mark Gestring from the University of Rochester Medical Center. Asher Beverages, the Rock's leader in old style homemade lemonade. It's Asher's secret recipe, so don't bother asking. If you're looking to impress, want to be one of the cool kids, and be the hit at your next party, bring one of Asher's delicious drink concoctions with you. Asher Beverages old style homemade lemonade is the way to go. Asher Beverages are available at all local retail outlets. Folks, welcome back to the Crime Dog Podcast. Thanks for sticking with us on the other side. Dr. Mark Gestring from the University Medical Center in Rochester, New York. Doc, we appreciate you sticking with us, even though that some of my co-hosts were doing a little bickering off air. We thank you for your patience. Some of the things that we started to talk about off air that we want to talk about now, we had some great convo. Mental preparedness relative to, I mean, we talked about the farmers and the relative to the Crime Dog Podcast, shooting victims, stabbing victims. How do you mentally prepare when you know someone's coming in with a knife stuck in their chest that's a quarter inch from their heart, they're non-responsive, or a gunshot victim or multiple gunshot victims, and they're unresponsive?
Sure. So, so as kind of a senior person in charge of this, and, I have 7 partners that all we take turns doing this. The opportunity, like, as much, pre-notification is super important. So you tell me, give me 10, 15 minutes to figure it all out, then it gives me a little bit of time to think through all this stuff. Sometimes you're not lucky. Sometimes somebody will just either be driven into the hospital and they just kind of show up, in which case you figure it out when they get there. But many times we'll get between 5 and 10 minutes notice that they're coming, and it gives you a chance to organize your team. You guys have been in our trauma bay. We have kind of big teams. Everybody has a specific job, but it gets, there's a lot of things going on at the same time. So as a senior person, you're kind of the conductor of the orchestra. You don't tell the clarinets necessarily how to play, but at the same time, you tell them when to play and when not to play. So that happens. And certainly around one patient who's critically ill, you want to make sure you have blood. You want to make sure you have x-rays ready. You want to make sure you have the surgical equipment that you might need. Let's say you have to open a chest or put a tube in or something like that. So you want to make sure that those things are ready and available to go. Like, we're blessed with fantastic nurses, so they know exactly what the next step's going to be almost always. And, the team does work well together. Sometimes when you look at it from the outside, it looks a little bit like chaos, but it really does work. Where it gets a little stressed, what we were talking about before, is if you get several of those at once, frequently the stress comes from not really knowing what you're getting, because from the field, you'll get all sorts of information, and you don't know whether you're going to get 3 patients or 9 patients. The information is just dribbling in. So you have to prepare for the worst and kind of work backwards from there. But trying to make sure that you have a team ready for each patient, trying to make sure you have blood available, make sure you have the equipment that you need, make sure you have the space that you need. More and more, the issue for us is space. The ED is pretty crowded. We have good systems for making space when we need it. The irony is, the sicker you are, the faster you move through the system, right? You show up in the emergency room with a simple complaint. It takes a little while to get it sorted out, but you show up with a bullet in your chest, you kind of fly right through and it gets sorted out very quickly. All of us have done this enough where you don't really get nervous. You just want to make sure other people stay calm, keep everybody else calm, keep everybody else on track. You want to make a guy like me nervous, you tell me I have to dance in front of a crowd or sing the Star Spangled Banner or something like that. That's how you make me nervous. But everybody has their skill set, and that's something that, people who are drawn to this work tend to.
So the interesting
stay
Doc,
focused.
is one of the things, though, is one of the things you set off break was, when it's a teachable moment, even with a stabbing victim or a gunshot victim, where you'll have maybe a quote unquote less experienced trauma surgeon in there, where you or maybe your senior staff will stay over and walk them through. And then there's times when you need to be autocratic.
Right, So we're a teaching hospital, so there's always residents, and they're senior residents, so they're pretty experienced. But there's weird things that come in and pretty serious things that come in. And many times the more senior person will step in and say, okay, watch me do this. This is not a good learning environment for you. Watch me do this, and then we can talk about it. So we have absolutely done, things like, somebody comes in with a hole in their heart, you're going to watch me fix it. I'm not going to watch you struggle through it. And that's purely because there's a very short window to do that. I mean, as it is, patients spend sometimes more time in the field than they needed to, that they're already, pretty far behind the 8 ball by the time they arrive. So we have these kind of time metrics. We have a big clock hanging in our trauma bay. And, if we haven't done something by 1 minute, 3 minutes, 5 minutes, and it's, we're kind of keeping ourselves on pace. And if somebody comes in, if you think they have a fixable problem, but they don't have a heart rhythm, for instance, you have about 1 to 3 minutes to open up the chest, get to the heart, and figure out what's going on if you're going to fix it. And I'm not going to teach you how to do that. You're going to watch me do that, in that scenario. And it's just, we use the airplane example. It's the same thing. You're sitting next to a student pilot and the mountain's getting bigger and bigger and bigger. You say, watch me steer away from the mountain, and then we can talk about it,
Well, I'll tell you, one of the things, and this isn't technology, and you mentioned it, the longer you are in the field, and this is not a secret with police officers. We're not waiting to get our brother's treatment in the field. We have officers in the back seat conducting CPR, and we're taking them to the hospital instead of waiting, and we're trying to get them to your trauma staff as soon as we possibly can. And we're trying to triage stuff the best that we can in the back seat.
The one piece that's super important, do exactly that. Don't waste time. Do exactly that, but let us know you're coming. And just talking to your microphone, tell them we're coming. I don't need to know the details. Just we need to know you're coming, because that way we'll be ready for you.
How long is a trauma surgeon residency? I know different medical areas have different longer residencies. How long is it for a trauma surgeon to really be proficient at their task?
At the end of the line, so for me, it was 4 years of medical school, 5 years of surgical residency, and then 2 years on top of that to be a trauma fellow. The residents that we get are in that 5-year phase, so we get them anywhere between their 4th and their 5th year of actual surgical training. So this is before they go on to do real trauma training. But there's, the skills that they need to have in order to progress are the same skills that, they would need in many other ways. So the kinds of things that we do, whether it's placing chest tubes or those kinds of things.
So it's undergrad, 4 years of medical, 5, and then 2.
Yeah. Oh yeah. No, it's a bit of a run. Yeah. Yeah.
So Doc, my question, A, is there a lot of turnover in your unit? And B, my thing that's going through my brain is, I like to win, and how do you handle quote unquote a loss? Like it must be very difficult being in a trauma situation where, and I'm walking through being in that situation and how I would handle that.
Those are both really good questions. So it's kind of strange, but we don't have much turnover. The trauma unit is, I hear you guys, talking about these high stress, like tactical and SWAT units and things. You don't get a lot of turnover in those units either. It's a bit of a brotherhood. We have retained our nurses, we have retained our techs, and our surgeons pretty much stay. They like the team environment. It's one thing to be stressed. It's another to be stressed as a team. And for whatever reason, we've built a really good kind of relationship, and we don't see a lot of turnover, which actually is kind of interesting, but there's no question it's a stressful job. And I think you lean on your buddies, you lean on your partners, and whether it's an experienced nurse, I'm not such an old guy, but I've definitely had nurses who've looked at me like, my nursing shoes are older than you, so that this is somebody that I'm going to pay attention to. And this is somebody who's lived the life and done this work for long enough where their voice is just as important as mine. The team kind of supports each other. And I think, getting to your question about loss, I think that is probably the hardest part of our job. But the way I look at it, if we have done everything we can do and it all went the way it was supposed to go, then I don't necessarily feel that bad. Because, if we provided lightning fast, appropriate care, had all the right stuff, did all the right things, and the patient doesn't survive, then it's a little bit out of my hands. If we fumbled the ball, then I feel like, well, geez, that's something we need to work on. And luckily, we don't do that very often. In life, things happen, but having the team, having them be ready, having everything work the way it's supposed to work, you can't fix everybody, but what you can do is try. And the whole theory behind being a trauma center is because you got lots of hospitals in the region, but being a trauma center means you have all of those things immediately available so that you can do those things when you need to. So you're not calling anybody in from home. You're not, we're able to, God forbid you bring in an injured officer. We can have that person in the operating room 4, 5, 8 minutes after they got there, if that's what they need. And that's the reason we have OR crews in-house, OR nurses, anesthesiologists, everybody sitting around. From a business point of view, it's extremely inefficient, right? Because you have everybody sitting there waiting to make a cheeseburger, even though it's 3 a.m, right? But when you need to do it, you need to do it. And unfortunately, or I guess whatever, we do it a lot. We do it a lot in the middle of the night.
Doc, when we were on the break, you got to witness something where our super producer, Danny Agnew, usually comes up with the best questions for our podcast.
Yeah.
And Danny was inquiring with you, what happens when you get those, multiple gunshot victims or multiple victims at the same time? You're 5, 6, 7, 9, 10. That's the first part of my question. The second part, you and Jay had a sidebar conversation after Danny had asked that question, because you started to exchange stories about experiences where you had busloads of people that you had to treat. And could you get into both of those?
Yeah, sure. So we asked about, you guys were talking about multiple casualty incidents. And I think the ones that tend to be a little bit more chaotic are the multiple shootings that happen close by, because the information is not really good. You kind of figure it out as you go along. We definitely ramp up when we need to. We call people in. We have a system for doing that if we need to. But when you ask me where do the most patients come from, and I find something wood to knock on, because really you don't want that to change. But we've had a couple of big bus crashes in our region. And interestingly enough, one was in Victor and one was in Livingston County on 390. And communication from those is pretty good because they're a little bit of a distance away. There's a triage officer who's calling ahead and they're figuring it out. And the way bus crashes work is they're pretty much mostly the same. A couple of people maybe in the front of the bus are killed. A bunch more are seriously injured. And then there's 15 or so that are just walking wounded. And at the scene, they're usually pretty good at figuring out who really needs injury care and who maybe just has something minor. So they figure that all out. Many times, if it happens close to the hospital, all of it just ends up on our doorstep and we have to figure it out. But we've had some significant multiple casualty events, and what gets lost in the details, there's the medical care clearly, and there's the response clearly. But then, people in buses, for instance, are many times together. Right. So we were talking, one of the bus crashes was a group of girls from Canada, if people remember. So that meant families needed State Department help crossing borders. Back then, we still paid attention to who crossed borders, and we needed to, sort that out. Right. So our social work department was fantastic about getting these families over from Canada, so that, we had 15 or 20 or so, whatever it was, girls in the hospital in various states of needing care and getting their families over. That was one example. There was another bus crash in Victor, where these were predominantly Spanish-speaking folk from New York City who were going to Niagara Falls. And one of 3 buses tipped over, and we suddenly needed a bunch of Spanish translators, because nobody spoke any English. So being able to mobilize that aspect of things. So that's not usually what people think about, as a first tier, but you really need to be able to communicate with people. And, we have Spanish translators. We don't have 30 of them.
Yeah.
So that those kinds of things, and the university really rose to the occasion in each of those cases to figure that stuff out.
Well, folks, we told you we had a good one. Stick with us on the other side. We got Dr. Mark Gestring from the University of Rochester Medical Center.
Gold Shield Pro Services, we're your trusted residential and commercial inspection experts. Call us for one of our professional, nationally certified inspectors to make your real estate investment seamless. At Gold Shield Pro Services, we specialize in thorough inspections, providing you with insights you need to make informed decisions. From pre-sale, post-sale, or annual routine inspections, your number one asset is our top priority. Call 662-7725. That's 662-7725. Or visit us at goldshieldproservices.com to book your appointment today.
Folks, thanks for sticking with us. On the other side, we have Dr. Mark Gestring from the University of Rochester Medical Center. Doc, thanks for sticking with us. We talked on break. We want to touch in our final segment about Project Exile. We hit upon that with Special Agent Resident in Charge Mike Curran, who's head of our ATF federal office in Rochester, New York, who you have a close relationship with because you are both on the Project Exile program committee. Can you talk a bit about your involvement with Project Exile?
Sure. Actually, that's a super interesting thing. So I was privileged probably 15, maybe even 16 years ago, something like that, to be invited to participate. Gary Mervis asked me to come and be on the board as the token doctor. We were doing some violence intervention stuff at the hospital, and we were kind of interested in getting involved. And he invited me to sit in on a couple of meetings. And, quite honestly, as a physician, I didn't really have a full grasp of how things worked. So I sat there and I got the sense for how all these different law enforcement agencies in Monroe County and Rochester and the surrounding area just totally got along. You have prosecutors that are federal, prosecutors that are state. You have all these different police departments, all these guys sitting around a table talking about things very collaboratively. I just thought that's the way the world worked. Well, fast forward a couple of years and I start seeing that's really not the way the world works. So we have an extremely unique situation here in Rochester and in Monroe County. And that organization has just been super interesting. So I've stayed involved. So, I've heard you guys talk about Project Exile, and to be clear, there's kind of two parts to it. There's the law enforcement side, which has absolutely ramped up in the, I guess Rochester's probably, I think it's currently the oldest in the country. I think Richmond, Virginia was first, but Richmond's not active anymore, is what I understand. There's a law enforcement side to it where the federal government and the local governments work together to see which crimes rise to the level of potentially federal prosecution. And that work used to be ongoing, but now it's daily, right? In terms of battling the issues that we're taking stock of in Rochester, so to speak. But the other side of it, which maybe doesn't get as much attention, is the community side. And that's kind of where I sit. So once a month, the group gets together and everybody around the table talks about what initiatives that are going on and different trainings that they're doing and different community activities that are going on. And, they figure out how to work together. And many of my kind of most important contacts have been developed in that exile setting. So it's my opportunity to come and meet the police chief from a department that I probably wouldn't get a chance to talk to otherwise. And we have a conversation in the hallway, and it turns out we can do something together. A perfect example, we formed a partnership recently with Todd Baxter and the Monroe County Sheriff's Office looking at responsible gun ownership, which it turns out there's not many medical centers really in that space. There's a lot of people talking about violence intervention, a lot of people talking about suicide prevention, but really nothing in the middle. So sitting down and talking with Sheriff Baxter, it became clear that, we have an interest in doing this. They absolutely had an interest in doing this. He committed Eric Perkins, who I don't know if you guys know, is a fantastic expert in in everything guns. And so, Eric works with us on a regular basis, and we go out to the community and we talk to people about their legally registered handguns and how to be responsible with them. And there's a huge interest on the part of people to say, tell me what to do. The laws in New York State are changing every 47 minutes, right? So how can I keep track? Even if I'm trying to do the right thing, the laws have changed. I don't understand. And then there's all the basic stuff, lock it up, keep it away from your kids, keep it away from your demented grandfather, the same way you wouldn't give them the keys to the car, wouldn't leave an unlocked gun laying in the house, those kinds of things. Another question that comes up all the time is, somebody in my house died. Now suddenly there's 6 guns. The guy who had them on his permit is dead now. What do I do with the guns? Those kinds of things. And, we work together, kind of giving advice, in a very non-confrontational way to people who are seeking it. And there's just a number of avenues that we've opened up, and that started at Exile, because I would never have the opportunity to communicate with all those people. And through an Exile event, I actually got to talk to the chief of the ATF. The ATF director was in town for their annual event, and I got a chance to corner him and talk to him about how we should be franchising this program around the country. And Mike Curran's helping us try to advocate for that, because this is something that is not unique. In Rochester, you could easily be in Idaho in a trauma center and work with your Idaho State Police or whatever, and figure out how to bring this message to a group of people who really want it. So that's just one example. I have seen over the years now how other communities kind of interact with each other. And there's no question that Monroe County and Rochester does a fantastic job. And I think, the success of that group has been because the leadership of Gary Mervis, for one.
Mm-hmm.
He is just a visionary in terms of bringing people together and looking beyond just the day-to-day issues. What can we do about things like the Project Tips, which, Jay and I got a chance to meet, doing a way to bring law enforcement to the community in a non-threatening way. And I think that really does make an effort. You had mentioned Anthony DePonzio. That's what started Tips. I don't know if you knew that.
I did not.
The very first Tips event was like a month or so after he was injured, and that was like January or February or something.
Mm-hmm.
And they went to the neighborhood where he got injured, and the idea was to get people out there to see if anybody would be willing to talk to the police. People are willing to talk to, they just don't want a police car sitting in front of their house, but they're willing to talk to you, if you're there and they come up. And so it's less about getting information, more about interacting with the community, more about trying to make a law enforcement argument that's not at a time when, life is complicated. But there's just so many things that organization does above and beyond the criminal justice side, which is super important and super effective. It's just, I've absolutely seen jurisdictions where, the various prosecutors at different levels don't speak, police chiefs don't speak. Unfortunately, I think I've been on that group long enough now to watch a bunch of police chiefs retire. People start as captains, they leave as chiefs, they retire, they come back as something else. So I think not many people have been on that group consistently longer than I have, but I'm the only guy who makes no progress, right? I'm I have the same job when I came in that one I have 20 years later, but it's a real pleasure to be part of that group. I think I'm able to bring a medical perspective to some of the work that people are doing, and I think that's kind of cool. I learn from them, they learn from us. I'm very thankful to be included in that.
I think the fact that you mentioned it's unique to Rochester, like I didn't understand that, right? I thought that other cities do what we do, and to hear that that's not the case, you kind of scratch your head, because we have, I feel like we don't let people's egos get in the way. We have such great organizations here, from law enforcement to the DA's office to the federal prosecutors to trauma centers, and when everybody buys into the same idea, it's hard to think that you won't be successful.
Yeah, and beyond that, I think it's now established into the fabric of, if you're going to come in a new role, you're going to be on Exile and you're going to participate. I vividly remember a while back where there was a new attorney general for the state. This is going back a few years, and that guy, proudly announced some drug bust that involved Puerto Rico and New York City and Rochester, and they were going to prosecute it on state charges. And everybody there in the room was polite, but that's not what this group does. And you could get so much more bang for your buck doing this federally. And this was purely about that particular individual's, and it's going back a ways now. So it's it was just a funny example of something that, working together, you can achieve so much more and be so much more effective and bring so many more resources to these real investigations. Things like these Glock switches and things like that, it's just craziness. And why would you not involve the federal government in helping you with that, especially when you can get some real prosecutorial punch out of that? And that's something that's a real threat to us, right? Why would you not want to use that kind of an instrument for something like that?
I spent, I was lucky enough to spend almost the last 6 years of my career with Mike Curran and ATF and the famous Mark Lee, my last sergeant that I ever worked for. But yeah, it's a hell of a collaboration. And again, and I know I sound like the old guy on the block, but there was that there was no collaboration when I came on 30 years ago. It was literally an us against them, especially with the feds. You know, it was screw those guys. You tell them about a case, they take everything from you, and then they leave you on the doorstep as a local officer. And that certainly is not the case anymore relative to how we go about doing police work. And it's refreshing to know that Sheriff Baxter and your collaboration with him with an idea that you guys are now collectively trying to take that nationally. That's pretty
yeah.
wild.
I mean, it's just one of kind of many relationships that came out of that. I mean, there's clergy involved in this. There's people from all sorts of social services. There's people from like the United Way and stuff like that. There's a lot of people at the table who bring a lot of resources, and people. That group wants to make this wants to make the community better, and there's no question they do, and they're really trying. So, helping young people with other options, so teaching them how to do job interviews, getting them a suit so they can do a job interview, getting them some basic skills for job interviews, that kind of work is going on. So Exile doesn't necessarily do it, but it encourages those discussions so that if you're looking for somebody, you want to hire somebody, well, this is where you can go. If you're looking for, you have a job fair or something like that, this is a group that you can use. And it's just, those kind of relationships are just, fantastic. It's really and been consistent. This isn't just a flash in the pan. I mean, this has been working now for however long, 20 years in this community, something like that.
Yeah. I usually leave it up to my co-host to end the show with any final thoughts for our guest. David, Jason, you got anything?
Very, very appreciative. You took the
Thank you.
opportunity to come in and spend some time with three dumb guys. So thank you very much.
Well, it's actually been a huge honor to be here. I pay attention to your podcast. I think you guys have a voice, a unique voice, and I think you enjoy doing what you're doing. And I enjoy the message that you guys are reasonable about the way you talk about things. And it's a great privilege for me to be here.
Well, thanks, Doc. I appreciate that. And that was Dr. Mark Gestring from the University of Rochester Medical Center in Rochester, New York. Can't thank you enough, Doc, for being here. Folks, we have a YouTube channel. It's called @CrimeDawg Podcast. Please go there, click like and subscribe. You'll see the library of videos that we have. If you don't want to do that, you can go to our website. It's called thecrimedawgpodcast.com, where you can also see the library of videos that we have, and it will direct you to our YouTube page. Thanks for sticking with us on this episode. Stay tuned for future episodes. But like my brother-in-law, Frankie Grassi, says, if you can't make it, who cares?